Good morning, everyone. We are lucky today to have with us, and forgive me, Rafael, if I mispronounce your last name, Rafael Dix Carneiro, uh,
Perfect.
and who is a full professor of economics at Duke University, and works on topics related to international trade, labor economics, and development economics. So I will, in keeping with our habit of allowing the speakers to say a few words about themselves, I'm going to hand it over to you. Um, and um, uh, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ludovico. So my name is Rafael Dix Carneiro. I'm a professor at Duke, as Ludovico mentioned. I was born and raised in Brazil, so I lived in Brazil until 2005. So I came to the US when I was 26 years old for graduate school. So I went to Princeton to get my PhD. I graduated in 2011. I had a short stay at the University of Maryland for 2 years. And then since 2013, I've been here at Duke. And given my background, most of my work has actually been studying the impacts of globalization on the Brazilian labor market. Okay. And as you're going to see, many of the papers that we're going to be talking today have actually been written with my co-author Brian Kovac, who's at Carnegie Mellon, but also with other colleagues. All right, so I think that as Nora and Ludovico mentioned, you guys are seeing the whole series of the Lassier papers, and what Lassier wanted to do with me in particular was a paper on understanding and sort of summarizing the impacts of globalization on inequality in Latin America. Okay, and then since I had done quite a bit of work on Brazil on the topic, I think that's how this paper started. I think it's nice to be presenting here because actually I only presented this at Lassier, and I think the very last time I presented this work was probably 2 years ago. So I had to refresh a little bit, go over my slides, and try to remember exactly what I wrote here. So the slides are going to be a little overpopulated. I only have 1 hour here, and I want to focus on only specific things. And actually, I was rereading the paper. There's a lot of information in the paper if you have read it. So by the end of this talk, if you have questions, if you have clarifications, and by the way, if you have questions along the way, I think you can use the chat, right? And Ludovico would stop me, and I can slow down a bit. Okay. But just as a notice, I'm not going to be covering everything on the slides, and I'm going to be jumping around a little bit. Okay. So again, this is a paper with Brian Kovac with the Carnegie Mellon, a very frequent co-author of mine. Okay, so for some reason, I'm not able to change. Oh, I am. Maybe I have to use my slides. Maybe I have to use my mouse. Okay. Okay. So there are many papers looking at the impact of globalization on inequality, labor markets, but what exactly sets Latin America apart? And there are a few reasons why Latin America is different from developed countries and even perhaps other developing countries, right, outside of the region. So first, Latin America has been through many, many decades of import substituting industrialization, right? And that means that governments throughout the region have, for decades, imposed very high tariffs, very high import tariffs on manufacturing sectors that were deemed to be good for growth. Okay, for example, Brazil in the 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s had very high tariffs on computers in order to help a computer industry to flourish. Brazil had very high tariffs on cars as well as electronic devices. Okay, and this is because this is believed that these sectors were key for countries to grow. So at the same time, these countries have these very high tariffs for many decades. Mostly in the 80s and early 90s, these countries started to abandon these policies. And there was a little bit of a shock therapy where these countries started to very drastically reduce these tariffs. Okay, so Latin America provides sort of an experimental laboratory where we can actually think about, what exactly happened to these countries as they very rapidly transition from a relatively closed, relatively closed economies to relatively open economies. Okay? The other thing that is different about Latin America, at least compared to developed countries, is that all around the region we have very highly regulated labor markets, with very high levels of employment protection, relatively high minimum wages, payroll taxes. And at the same time, governments throughout the region, they don't have, full capacity to enforce these rules. And as a result, what we see in all throughout Latin America are large informal labor markets. Okay, and this mostly happens because firms that are very unproductive and small, they see a way out of these, burdensome regulations by operating under the radar of the government. Okay, so typically, when we think about informality, we're thinking about firms that are not paying taxes, they're not complying with regulations, and this is because the government cannot perfectly enforce the rules, right? And this is going to be something interesting, something that I have exploited a lot here, which is what is the role of these informal labor markets when we try to understand the effect of globalization in these Latin American countries, right? And then finally, the other thing that sets Latin America apart compared to developed economies is this very high dependence on commodities. Okay, so in Latin America in particular, if you look at all of these trade liberalization episodes in the 80s and 90s, there were very drastic episodes from which we can learn a lot about the consequences of globalization. But also Latin America has a wealth of data. Many countries in Latin America have very high quality household surveys. They have very high quality administrative data in which you can actually, trace trajectories of workers across firms, sectors, regions, and for many, many years. Okay. And so Latin America was a natural context for many papers to be written on the effect of globalization on inequality and the labor market. And then we can see a very large range of methodologies and dimensions of inequality being studied, in the past 10 to 15 years. Now, if you're interested in the topic of globalization and inequality in general, and specifically on, developing economies, there's a very good survey by Penny Goldberg and Ina Pauchnik. By now it's almost 20 years old. So that paper has focused on Latin America, India, and Hong Kong. So you can think about our paper as coming just, an update of sort of that survey, and we're going to be covering a lot of papers that came out, after 2007 mostly. Okay, and these papers, they have used new data compared to that survey. They have used new methodologies, and they have focused on new dimensions of inequality. So one thing that is going to that is going to become apparent here is that globalization can have impacts on a very wide range of inequalities within countries. Okay, so we're gonna see that trade is going to be affecting regions differently, is going to be affecting sectors differently, and then there are many other papers focusing on how trade and globalization can affect, inequality across gender, race. There are going to be other measures of inequality beyond the labor market. Trade has been shown to affect crime, health outcomes, whether people get educated, and so on and so forth. So one thing that came out, in the past 15 years is just this very rich description of how globalization can affect inequality. And one thing that is going to come out as well is that the Lassiere management was very okay. So tell us, did globalization increase or decrease inequality in the region? And unfortunately, the one thing that we discuss in the paper, and I'm going to share here with you, is that it's going to be very hard to have very sharp answers about this question, just because this phenomenon is so complex and affects so many dimensions. It's very hard to put all these dimensions together in a coherent framework and have a unique answer for this question. So in a way, I'm going to be talking about a lot of results. We learned a lot about the effect of globalization on inequality, but I'm not going to have a single answer for the direction of this impact. Okay, so the plan here for the talk is the following. So the very first thing that Brian and I did in this paper was just just have some descriptive patterns. We just put some descriptive patterns together, and we just wanted to see, following these very drastic liberalization episodes in Latin America over the 80s and 90s, could we find some, robust patterns following these episodes? Okay, so do we see any robust pattern of how unemployment is changing over time, how inequality is changing over time after these episodes, and also we look at informality, right? We don't want to overinterpret these results, because many of these countries, they open up for trade at the same time they implemented various other policies, labor market policies, stabilization policies, and et cetera. So it's very hard to disentangle the effects of trade liberalization from these other policies. But we want to see if something jumps at the eye, right? So after I cover these very descriptive aggregate patterns, we're going to jump into new directions that the literature on trade and inequality has followed, specifically after the Goldberg and Pauchnik paper that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Okay, and one particular dimension that became very popular in the past 15 years was to understand how globalization and trade liberalization affected regions within the country in uneven ways, right? Then we're going to be talking about what is the role of informal labor markets in helping labor markets to adjust. We're going to be thinking about gender and race-specific impacts, and we're going to also be talking about the fact that globalization can have effects on inequality beyond the labor market. Okay, so it can have effects on consumption, educational decisions, crime, health, and even political outcomes. Then I'll briefly talk about this new literature. So let me take a step back here. So we're going to, the literature has very convincingly shown that trade liberalization episodes, especially drastic trade liberalization episodes, can have, strong disruption effects, right? So whenever you open up for trade, imports come in, jobs are displaced, and there's an adjustment process that ensues. And so there's a rich literature now trying to, bring in some of these real world elements of unemployment, of labor market frictions across sectors, informal labor markets into our models of trade, which can help us think about, broader consequences of trade from the perspective of these richer economic models, right? With very rich distributional consequences that are allowed. And then in terms of implications, one thing that I'm going to be talking about here is that one thing that we need today is to have a lot more evidence on how we can smooth labor market outcomes of workers that are adversely affected by trade, right? So one thing that comes out of this literature is that not everyone benefits from trade. And therefore, you as a government, if you want to implement, or if you want to implement trade liberalization, or if you want to sustain a trade liberalization agenda, you really have to care about those workers who are left behind, right? Either because you really believe in redistribution, you think that the gains from trade have to be shared equally across workers, or because you're not really concerned about redistribution, but you care deeply about liberalization agenda, right? And if you care deeply about a liberalization agenda, you may be concerned that people who are negatively affected by liberalization may actually go and vote against liberalization and stop the process altogether. Okay, so thinking about smoothing policies in this context is going to be, I think, is a priority for trade economists going forward, and we're going to be discussing some of this evidence going forward. But still, this is an area where there's very, very little work on. Okay, for a number of challenges. Okay, so let's go back here and let's talk about these descriptive patterns that I mentioned at the beginning. So we're going to be looking at 4 outcomes. So the very first thing that we're going to look at, and here we're going to be looking at what we call event studies. Okay, we're going to be looking at the evolution of different variables. We're going to be looking at just before these countries open up for trade and right after these countries open up for trade. So here you can see in this figure, you have this year 0. Year 0 is when a given country opened up for trade. Of course, countries open up for trade at different points in time, but we're bringing all the countries together here, and we're starting to track variables as soon as they open up for trade. And then we're going to be looking at the behavior of these variables before they open up for trade and then after. Okay? Now, the first variable that we're looking here is trade openness, which is traditionally measured as the ratio between imports plus exports divided by GDP. Okay, so this is the importance of trade in a country's economy. And one thing that you see here that is very intuitive that it happened, but it's good that it happened, right? Is that trade openness started to increase substantially after these countries open up for trade. Okay, but these countries reduce import tariffs. Not surprisingly, they start trading more intensively with the rest of the world. Okay, but what are the consequences of this increase in trade openness? Okay, so let's first look at the inequality, the big topic of the paper. And what we see here is nothing really jumps at the eye, but if you wish, we can see here that maybe inequality increased a little bit 10 years after these liberalization processes started, and then it declines in the longer run. Okay, but these effects are very, very noisy. Nothing really major jumps at the eye here. Now, unemployment is a bit more interesting, and it's a little more robust. We do see that after liberalization, these countries do go through increases in unemployment in the medium run, if you wish, right? But then eventually, labor market seems to be adjusting, and then unemployment goes back to the previous level. Okay. And then regarding informality, what we see here, we see perhaps an increase in the short run in informality, and then this effect dissipates over time. And, you know, if you went maybe in the long run, informality appears to even be declining a little bit. Okay, so these are sort of, we conducted this exercise just to see, are there any patterns, aggregate patterns that really jump at the eye? But we don't want to be over-interpreting these results because, of course, there are many things happening at the same time in these various countries. Okay, but still, we think that that was a nice thing to do, just to see whether you know, some really strong patterns are showing up here. Okay, so let me jump a little bit ahead. Okay. Now, given this descriptive evidence, let's talk about, you know, what's new in this literature on globalization and inequality. And one development that has been very important is to try to understand whether globalization had uneven effects across regions within the country. Okay, and what's the idea here? The idea here is that countries have various regions, but these regions are not producing the same stuff. Okay, you can think about one region producing, you know, cars. The other region is producing a mix of rubber and agriculture. The other region is producing a mix of electronic devices, apparel, and some agriculture, and so on and so forth. Okay, so regions are producing different stuff. Okay. And the other thing is that typically in these trade liberalization episodes, not all sectors are affected the same way. We see a lot of variation on tariff reductions across sectors. Okay, so if you couple that variation in tariff reductions across sectors with the fact that regions are producing different things just before liberalization, that suggests that regions producing goods facing larger tariff declines, okay, they're going to be exposed to more input competition than regions that are producing goods that do not face large tariff declines. Okay, so you might expect that there's going to be a decline in labor demand in the highly exposed region relative to what's happening in the less exposed region. Right? To make things concrete here, let's think about two regions. One region is agricultural, and the other region is producing heavy manufacturing goods. Okay, and let's suppose here that the government only reduces tariffs on heavy manufacturing goods. Okay, therefore, we would expect that the region specialized in producing heavy manufacturing goods is going to suffer more from import competition than the region producing agricultural goods. Okay, so this idea was first, you know, developed in a paper by Topalova, who actually focused on India, right? And basically, she focused on a regression that looks like this. Okay, so she was very interested in understanding how import competition in India. So India went through a trade liberalization episode in the 1990s, drastically reduced tariffs on heavy manufacturing goods. Okay, not so much on agricultural goods. And then Topalova wanted to see whether, okay, so what is happening to poverty in regions that are more exposed to import competition as a result of liberalization compared to regions that are not as exposed. Okay, so she developed this measure, which she called regional tariff reduction that region R is facing. And that regional tariff reduction captures this intuition that I gave a minute ago. Okay, so it is going to be a weighted average of industry-specific tariff reductions, where the weights are given by industry mix within the region. Okay, so these lambda RIs here are going to be the share of employment of region R employed in industry I. Okay. So if you think about this measure is going to say that, again, if we only have two sectors, and we have a region that is highly exposed to agriculture and one region that is highly exposed to heavy manufacturing, if tariffs in manufacturing are declining and agricultural tariffs are constant, then the heavy manufacturing region is going to face a much larger import competition shock than the agricultural region. Okay, and therefore you might think that labor market conditions are going to go down in the heavy manufacturing region relative to the agricultural region, and therefore poverty in the heavy manufacturing region is going to be increasing relative to the agricultural region. Okay, so that's the Topalova approach. That was a 2010 paper. And then there are the other papers that came out after Topalova. So Kovac, my co-author, actually, takes this very intuitive approach from Topalova and actually writes down a framework, writes down a model to make sense. Okay, so under what conditions would it make sense to go in the data and estimate the regression that Topalova had, and then his model delivers something that looks very similar to what Topalova had estimated. Okay, now let's apply this the Kovac framework to data from Brazil, and in particular. Let's apply that framework to the trade liberalism episode that happened in Brazil between 1990 and 95. So trade liberalism in Brazil between 1990 and 95 led to very large reductions in tariffs across almost all sectors. The only sector that did not face tariff reductions in Brazil was agriculture. Okay, but then we can think about sectors such as apparel and rubber facing very large declines in tariffs. You can also think about, you can see here the auto transport vehicles sector also face very large tariff reductions. Okay, and just as an anecdote here, I grew up in Brazil during that time, and I do remember vividly that just before trade liberalization, we could only see 3 or 4 brands of cars on the street. Right. So, and that's because Fiat, what else we had? Volkswagen and Ford. These are the 3 builders. I mean, these cars were not imported, right? So we had these multinationals actually producing in Brazil. And even though they were very heavily protected by tariffs, but we didn't see any other cars in these 3 brands, right? And after trade liberalization happened, then we see a flood of actually French cars coming in. So we started to see a lot of Peugeots, and Renaults, which were a complete novelty to us. Okay, and that was mostly because the Brazilian government started to reduce these tariffs on cars. Okay, but what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to be looking at this variation in tariff reductions. Okay, coupled with the fact that you're going to have regions that are mostly specialized in agriculture. And these regions are not going to be facing a lot of import competition because tariffs did not decrease much in agriculture. But if you have regions that are, specialized in apparel, food processing, and cars, these regions face very large increases in import competition coming from abroad as a result of these tariff reductions. Okay, and that's going to lead to this map where the dark blue lines are going to be regions that are mostly agricultural. Okay, so they don't face larger shocks coming from trade liberalization, so they're not very exposed to increases in import competition, just because they're producing these goods that don't face large reductions in tariffs. But then we're going to see the lighter regions, the yellow regions, and these regions are going to be regions producing things like apparel or cars or other goods that face very large tariff reductions. Okay, and then the broader local labor market approach here is going to be, we're going to be comparing the evolution of labor market outcomes in these yellow, highly affected places to the green regions that are still highly affected, but not as much as the yellow ones. And we're going to be comparing the evolution of these outcomes also with the labor market outcomes of these dark blue regions, which are regions that were, in principle, not affected at all by import competition induced by liberalization. Okay. And that led Brian and I to estimate regressions of that type. And these regressions, let me just explain what they were capturing. We're looking at the change of some outcome here at the region level. Okay, so we're looking at, say, employment. We're looking at the change in employment at each of these regions here in this map. And we're relating these changes to how exposed they became to import competition after trade liberalization. Okay, but what is going to be key here for our paper is that we really want to trace the dynamic effects of trade liberalization on labor market outcomes across regions. Okay, we want to think about what are the short-run effects of trade liberalization across regions, the medium-run effects, as well as the long-run effects. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to be looking here is how did the employment across regions respond to trade liberalization? Okay, and then here, because of data limitations, we're going to be focusing on formal employment. Okay, so we can only observe formal employment at the regional level, at this fine regional level, every year using formal labor market data, right? So these are the data from, these are administrative data from the Ministry of Labor. But what this figure is showing is that I'm plotting here estimates of these theta t coefficients, okay? I wanted you to think about trade liberalization in Brazil happening once and for all. And then I'm going to be tracing the dynamic effects of liberalization by plotting these effects theta t over time. And what we see here is that regions that were producing goods more exposed to declines in tariffs, what we see is that formal employment in these places are declining over time. Okay, and these declines are slow moving. Okay, so the short run effects are modest, the medium run effects are more important, and the long run effects are even larger. Okay, so that means that you're hit with an import shock. Labor markets, employment doesn't respond much in the short run, perhaps because people are slow to move away from these highly affected places. But over time, these people are eventually able to move and maybe even migrate to other regions, right? So this is what a standard spatial equilibrium model would predict would happen if you're hit with a negative labor demand shock, okay? Because now you're producing stuff that faces head-to-head competition with cheaper stuff from abroad. Labor demand goes down, wages would go down, and then eventually, workers would leave the region. And as workers leave the region, you see this low impact on employment, okay, which is actually what is shown here. Now, there's something that surprised Brian and I, which is that, if you think about these standard spatial equilibrium models, they would predict that wages would fall in the short run, okay, as you phase this declining labor demand. But as workers move away from the formal sector and as workers move away from these affected regions, wages will recover in the long run, okay? But, when we plot what happened to wages, we don't see this, okay? What we see in wages is actually a slow process where trade liberalization affects the region. wages, they do fall at impact in the very short run. They recover slightly in the medium run, but then wages enter in this process that they start to decline for extended periods of time until they stabilize 15 years later. Okay, and that was surprising to us because that was not what our standard spatial equilibrium models would predict. Okay, instead of wages recovering in the long run, what we see here is actually wages, the impact of import competition on wages actually are long-lived and they grow over time. Okay, now we started to ask ourselves, okay, so what explains this? Okay, and what explains this is that what was missing in our standard spatial equilibrium models is that this import competition has not only short-run effects on labor demand, but it can also have dynamic and long-run effects on labor demand. Okay, so let me be specific here. Okay, so if you are, say, a producer of a good, okay, in a let me give some examples here. So if you're a producer of cars, okay, and now you're facing import competition, say from France, okay, what is going to happen is that you still have your factory. Your factory has been built, and you can still sell cars, right? But eventually, some of these machines are going to break, right? And so you're going to start producing less cars. And you're not going to replace the machine because replacing the machine is going to be very expensive. And you cannot recover some of these expenses because now demand for your car is down because of this import competition from France. Okay, so slowly over time, machines break. Okay, and you don't replace the machines, and then eventually all your machines broke, and then you exited the market. Okay, you as a firm, you eventually exit the market. Okay, so this story, this very stylized story, seems to be what's happening in the data. Okay, we do see that firms in these affected labor markets, they start to exit the market, but they only exit the market very slowly over time, consistent with the story where, okay, your capital depreciates over time, and you don't replace it, okay, and eventually all of your capital has depreciated, and then eventually you exit the market, okay, and this is something that suggests that labor demand falls at impact because you're facing this head-to-head competition, but labor demand in these affected places keep falling over time as capital slowly reallocates from these highly affected places to less affected places. Okay. Now, what is interesting about this is, okay, so what are the implications for inequality? Okay. It turns out that the more exposed locations, okay, in Brazil, these regions, the yellow regions here, were actually, so the regions that were facing larger import competition shocks, these are actually, more industrialized places that were initially richer. Okay, so the implication of that is that these regions, the labor market of these regions, is going down relative to the labor market of these regions. Okay, and so that had an effect of reducing interregional inequality in Brazil, right? So these guys start ahead of these guys, and then trade liberalization is just going to be reducing the wages of these guys relative to these guys. Okay, and then in the paper we perform a back of the envelope calculation using some of these estimates. Okay, and we actually explain that trade liberalization explains about 25% of the decline in interregional inequality in Brazil between 1990 and 2010. So not negligible. So it's a big chunk of the interregional inequality in Brazil can actually be explained by trade liberalization. Now, I talked about what is happening in terms of inequality across regions, okay? But what about within region? Okay, so I mean, again, inequality has many dimensions. You can have interregional dimensions, but also within region. Okay, so I have another paper with Brian Kovac where we show there is actually a small effect of trade globalization on within region and across workers with different skill levels. Okay. Now, there's one problem here in thinking about, okay, what is the overall impact of liberalization in Brazil on inequality? Okay, and I think this highlights the tension that we put forward in the paper, which is that um, there's no single paper analyzing the effect of many dimensions of inequality at the same time. Okay, so there's the first paper that I talked about focusing on interregional inequality, and then there's this other paper that I'm highlighting here focusing on inequality across across skills within regions. But the two frameworks that we have, they are inconsistent with each other. So it's very hard to say, what is going to be the net, what was the net effect of globalization on inequality in Brazil. Okay. We can confidently say that, trade globalization reduced interregional inequality. It had small effects on within region inequality, but then it's hard to put the whole picture together. Okay. All right, so I just talked about the effect of trade liberalization on local labor markets in Brazil. But there's another, and let me keep track of time here. I'm being way slower than I wanted. So let me try to speed up a bit. Instead of just using changes in tariffs, you can also use changes in import competition. Okay. And then you can estimate exactly the same regression as before. We're interested in understanding how region-specific labor market outcomes are evolving in response to a region-specific exposure to import competition. Okay, and then the idea here is very similar as before. There's a little bit of a typo here. This should be a lambda RI coefficient. But we want to think about, okay, so China became a really big player in international trade over the 2000s. Okay, and there was a lot of variation on how China became really big exporters. Okay, so China tends to, at least until 2010 and 2015, China used to be mostly an exporter of low skill intensive goods such as furniture, toys, plastic goods, and things like that. Okay. And then you can interact these changes in import competition with your local industry mix in order to have a region-specific exposure to import competition. Okay. And then you can run exact same regressions as before, right? And then, so in the context of the US here, okay, so there's this famous paper by Arnold and Hansen showing that regions in the US that were more exposed, that were producing goods, more exposed to import competition from China, we see a decline in manufacturing in these locations, okay? Now, the flip side of that is that in Brazil, there's this paper by Costa, Garrett, and Pessoa, which show that, well, China actually worked as an import competition shock for many industries in Brazil as well. But China had to produce all of these goods using commodities, and in particular soy, and China started to grow a lot and started to import, beef from Brazil, etc. So at the same time, the emergence of China affected some manufacturing industries in Brazil. It really positively affected, commodities producers in the country. Okay, and then this paper by Costa, Garrett, and Pessoa contrasts these two effects. Okay, the negative effects from China in in urban centers, as opposed to the positive effects from China which occurred mostly in more rural centers in the country. Okay, this is just to say that the China shock, or the Chinese, or the emergence of China as a big international player, had particular pronounced distributional consequences. Negatively affected some regions, but positively affecting others. Okay, so I'm not gonna spend too much time on this, because otherwise, that would take maybe 10 or 15 minutes. One thing that is discussed in the paper is that these types of regressions that are showing you this type of regression, or this type of regression, does not tell us what are the total effects of liberalization on wages or employment within the country. They can only tell us what is happening to one region relative to another. So there are good methodologies to talk about inequality. Okay, so how is one region doing relative to another? What are the uneven effects of globalization? But there are not methodologies to tell us that, oh, liberalization in Brazil was bad for formal employment. You cannot say this. Okay, you can only talk about these unequal effects of liberalization across locations. Okay, so whenever someone tells you that trade liberalization was bad for the U.S., don't believe it. We cannot show this. We just cannot. Okay, if someone tells you that trade liberalization in Brazil was bad for the Brazilian labor market, again, we cannot say this. The methodology does not allow us to say any of that. These methodologies can only tell us that regions within the country were differently affected. Okay, so some regions benefited more than others. That's all we can say. Okay, that's a methodological limitation. Now, if you want to get grandiose statements about whether liberalization was good or bad, you cannot just rely on the data. You have to use some economic model to think about these aggregate consequences. Okay, so this is just a note of caution here. Okay, so discussing the paper, I'm skipping this. Okay, so now let's get on stuff that is a bit more specific, okay, to Latin America here, right? So, which is, Latin America has large informal labor market, okay? Now, what is informality? You can distinguish maybe what informality means for a firm versus a worker. For a firm, a firm is informal if it is not registered with the tax authorities. So essentially, informal firms are invisible to governments. Okay, and they're able to operate because governments don't have the full capacity to go after these firms. And it's not even clear that the government wants to do such a thing, but that's another story. Okay, and then on the other side, on the worker side, you're going to have workers that are not covered by labor regulations. Okay, so these are workers who don't have a formal contract with the employer. Okay, and therefore, if they're not covered by labor market regulations, they have no benefits such as Social Security, contributions from the employer. They may not have vacation days. Their wages might not be bound by the minimum wage, etc. Okay, and if they're fired, the employer is not going to be liable for severance payments. Usually, self-employed are included in the informal sector because the self-employed, they don't benefit from labor market regulations. Okay, and one thing that you have to think about here is that when we talk about the self-employed in Latin America, the vast majority are low-skilled self-employed people who are not paying taxes and just getting by, right? So these are people maybe selling fruit on the street, or maybe selling some food on the street. So these are very precarious employment conditions. Okay, now informality is very pervasive in Latin America. Okay, so in a World Bank report in 2007, we see that these informality rates, they range from 35% in Chile to all the way to 80% in Peru. Okay, and Brazil is right in the middle at 50%. So 50% of the labor force in Brazil is typically informally employed. Okay, either these guys are self-employed, or these guys are working in informal firms that are not legally registered with the government. Okay, so why is this important? Well, informality is important for a host of reasons. For one thing, if you have a large informal sector, you have a very large mass of firms that are not paying taxes and therefore not contributing to the provision of public goods. The other thing is that informal firms have been shown to be much smaller and much less productive than formal firms. So the government is essentially treating these small and unproductive firms favorably relative to the bigger formal firms, okay? Because the small ones are not subject to taxes and they're not subject to burdensome regulations, okay? And the fact that the government is, favorably treating these firms can potentially lead to large misallocation of resources, right? So you can have this sector that is unproductive, but it's overproducing relative to what would be socially optimum, okay? And of course, from the perspective of informal workers, these are bad quality jobs, right? They don't have access to unemployment insurance, no Social Security contributions, no job stability. These are typically considered much lower quality jobs than formal sector ones, okay? But one possible positive aspect of informality is that it may provide de facto flexibility for firms and workers to cope with adverse shocks, okay? So as firms are now facing import competition from abroad, they may find a way out by reducing their production costs by moving to the informal sector, okay? And in that case, they don't have to pay payroll taxes, they don't have to comply with minimum wages, and so on and so forth, okay? So that might be a second best. The fact that there's an informal sector to absorb some of these trade displaced workers may be something good, okay, in these countries. We don't know. Okay, so in a follow-up paper, Brian and we actually look at what happens to the labor market structure in these regions, okay, in response to these region-specific shocks, okay, induced by trade liberalization. So what we see is that in the short run, these regions that are more exposed to import competition, they go through increases in unemployment, okay? In the longer run, unemployment falls, okay? So falls back to trend, okay? So there's no effect on unemployment in the long run, but there's a large increase in informal employment in these locations, okay? And that suggests that actually the informal sector could have worked as a buffer to trade displaced workers, okay? And then we put this idea forward that maybe if the informal sector was not there, the effect of trade competition, right? So the effect of import competition on unemployment could have been much more severe and much more long-lasting, okay? So that's a potentially positive aspect of the informal sector here. Okay, now, so this paper shows that these shifts to unemployment and informality in response to increases in import competition, these appear to be empirically important margins of adjustment to trade. Okay, and then it turns out that our models, though, if we think about economic models of trade and how we think about the effects of trade, we don't have an informal sector in these models. And now we ask the question of how important it is to quantitatively is it for us to actually incorporate the informal sector into our models of trade, okay? This is important because the methodologies before, okay, they don't tell us, again, what is the total effect of import competition on informality. They only tell us what happens to one region relative to another, okay? So for us to be able to say something about the aggregate effect of trade on informality, we need a general equilibrium framework to be thinking about these aggregate effects. Okay, and that's what comes in this paper that I have with other co-authors, we precisely start to think about what if we enrich our models of trade with the informal sector. Okay, how important is it to include the informal sector into our models of trade, and whether that does that change at all how we think about the effect of trade on the economy. And we actually find that once we develop this model and we take it to the data and we estimate it, we find that liberalization actually leads to a decline in the informal sector. Okay, and by leading to a decline in the informal sector, it reallocates resources from the least productive informal firms to the more productive formal firms. It reduces misallocation, and it means that the gains from trade are magnified. Okay, so that's an important lesson. Gains from trade can actually be much larger in developing countries with large informal sectors because trade can undo some of the misallocation produced by the informal sector. Okay, and then we do find in the paper that yes, the informal sector works as a buffer to displace workers, but this reallocation, to the informal sector can have adverse consequences. Okay, because it amplifies misallocation, right? So the informal sector works as a buffer to trade displaced workers, but as you relocate resources to the informal sector, it's bad for the overall economy because you're increasing, resources are badly allocated now. Okay, and you also we find interesting implications for inequality. We find that trade liberalization leads to an increase in wage inequality across firms, okay, in the formal sector. But then if you put all firms together, formal and informal, we actually find that the liberalization actually tends to reduce informality in the economy as a whole. So here it's something that is important coming out of this is that, well, if you want to understand the effect of trade on inequality, it's not enough to just focus on data from the formal sector. You have to bring in data and you have to pay attention to what might be happening in the informal sector as well. Okay, so the direction of these effects can be actually quite different. Okay, so I'm really out of time. I think my hour finishes right now, but I'm going to steal 5 minutes from the Q&A because I just want to briefly talk about other things here. And you see, I mean, I'm way behind schedule here.
That's perfectly fine. Please proceed.
All right. So, I mean, the thing here is that people have exploited, the impacts of globalization on a very wide array of inequality dimensions, right? So, trade can have different effects across people with different skills, educated, non-educated. It can have effects on people with different genders. It can have effects on health outcomes, crime, etc. Okay, let me just say here very quickly that people have exploited these effects across gender. The effects that come out of these analyses are not super clean. It's hard to really interpret these effects. Okay, then I'm gonna okay. So let me just say one thing. The reason why we would expect trade to affect men and women differently is just because when we look at the data, we do see various sectors in the economy employing men and women in various intensities, right? So textiles and apparel is a famous example of a very female friendly sector, right? So these sectors tend to be quote unquote female intensive, right? And this is one reason why trade can have various effects, different effects across men and women in the economy. The other reason is that men and women may be facing different labor market frictions. Okay, when they lose their jobs and try to find another one. The other reason is that technology adoption can also be affecting how men and women do on the labor market, right? You can think about, if you have some technologies that actually replace tasks that are very physical, these tasks are going to be hurting much more men than women, right? And then there are other reasons as well, such as, if you have more import competition, if you have more competition in general in product markets, then that gives less room for employers to discriminate against women. Okay, so many reasons why trade can be affecting the gender gap in the labor market. But unfortunately, you have a few papers thinking about trying to measure this effect, but the results are a little all over the place, and no single conclusion there. I'm just going to be very quick here. Of course, the labor market is, I only talked about labor market effects so far, but you may think that, impacts of trade occur through the labor market mechanism, but also through consumption, right? And you may think that, and Porto has a nice paper on Argentina, thinking about the effect of Mercosur on consumption inequality. And then, what happened is that the poor people tend to consume a disproportional share of food processed goods. And then, trade tends to be, pro-poor in the sense that it reduces the prices of these food goods, okay? So this is a consumption channel where actually trade liberalization can actually be very good for the poor. Then, trade can have effects on education. People can change their education decisions because of globalization. Trade can affect crime because trade can have effects on unemployment. And as, unemployed people are more, susceptible to end up in criminal activities. That has been shown as well in the context of Brazil. It can affect health, as it affects labor markets. It can have other impacts on health, and this is particularly important. It can also affect how people vote, and many papers in developed economies, but also in developing economies, have shown that people are responding to trade liberalization by voting. Okay, and this is important because it's not just a curiosity that trade is affecting labor markets and inequality. People are reacting to that, right? And precisely for that reason, let me just skip some of that stuff here. Precisely for that reason, it is important for us to be thinking about what are good ways for government to smooth labor market trajectories of these trade displaced workers, okay? Now, the problem with this is that we don't have a ton of evidence on that. The only paper, and it's a very good paper, but it's not a paper on Latin America. It's actually a paper on the U.S. Showing that the Trade Adjustment Systems Program, where the government actually gives some community college training to some of these eligible workers, some of this retraining has very large impacts on future earnings and employability, okay? But that's just one paper, and we need a lot more evidence on effective ways to help these workers who are negatively affected by trade, okay? And this is important because we want, if you have ever taken an international trade class, or if you read economists talk about trade, we typically say, well, trade is actually a force that can be good for everyone, right? But we know from our models that you need the government to step in to redistribute, income from the more affected, the winners to the losers, right? And how this can be done in effective ways that can be done is very important to figure that out. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to say. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I didn't manage my time very well. I cut through a lot of stuff, but hopefully you can read the paper if you haven't read it yet. and maybe I can, clarify a few questions in the next few minutes.
Not at all, Rafael. A very, very rich presentation. Thank you very much. I mean, there is so much there that I can see how it presents challenges. We have two questions in the Q&A, three actually. Why do some developing countries experience increased wage inequality after trade liberalization, contrary to traditional economic models? What factors could explain why globalization has not always reduced inequality as expected?
Okay. Should I start with this, or you want to?
Yeah, let's go one by one.
Okay, so let me go back to the very beginning of the presentation. We don't really have very strong evidence whether trade reduce or increase inequality. Okay, and this is because there are many dimensions of inequality. Okay, and in particular in Brazil here, if anything, I mean the paper that I have with Brian Kovac has actually shown that trade might have reduced wage inequality across regions and might have reduced wage inequality across skills. Okay, working in a consistent way with I think the standard trade model that you referred to here. Now it is true that that particular comment resonates very well with the Goldberg and Pauchnik paper that I mentioned at the beginning, right? The survey from 2007, right? So the survey from 2007 observes, right, that, okay, let me take a step back here. For those not familiar with trade models, the one workhorse model of trade called the Hatch-Rowland model would suggest that as rich countries integrate with poor countries, okay, we would see inequality increases in rich countries and inequality decreases in poor countries, okay? And then the Goldberg and Pauchnik paper observes that actually we see wage inequality increasing in the US and in countries such as Mexico, Brazil, and some other countries, okay? So I think Argentina and Chile, etc. How come, right? So these countries are going through large trade liberalization episodes. The standard workforce model would predict that inequality should be declining. Okay. One thing to pay attention to is that there are other policies being conducted in these countries at the same time. So it's very hard to say that trade actually increased inequality. Maybe the other reforms and the other events were increasing inequality further, and trade might have a decrease in inequality there. Okay. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that many papers came out in the past 15 years with other explanations for why trade could be increasing inequality in poor countries. Okay, it could be inequality across firms. So the paper that I mentioned with Goldberg, McGear, Lucea. We have a link between trade and inequality across firms, and other mechanisms have been, if capital it really complements skilled workers, okay, so liberalization decreases the price of capital, and by decreasing the price of capital, countries now are more they can buy more capital, okay, but buying a lot of capital is going to be increasing the demand for skilled workers. Relative to unskilled workers, and that can increase inequality as well. Okay, but the point here is that I could keep going on here for hours on that specific question, but I'm just going to stop there.
Excellent, thank you. Another question says, a big challenge in studying globalization and inequality is that different studies focus on separate aspects, making it hard to see the full picture. What specific methodologies or data sources do you think future researchers should prioritize to develop a more comprehensive understanding of globalization's socioeconomic effects?
Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, so this is something we really emphasize in the paper, right? So typically we have frameworks tailored to study one specific dimension of inequality, and many times these different frameworks are going to be inconsistent with each other. So it's hard to draw a big picture conclusion, right, from these separate studies. I mean, the challenge here is going to be one that is about, there's always a trade-off between, simplicity, right, and intuitive, lessons, and more complicated frameworks and maybe more opaque conclusions, right? So naturally, if you want to look at the effect of trade on inequality, taking into account regional dimensions, industry dimensions, skill dimensions, gender dimensions, you will end up with a bit of a monster of an economic model, where you can analyze all of these, uneven effects of trade jointly, but it's going to be a little beast of an economic model, right? It's going to be I think what we can try to do more and more is to maybe, instead of just looking at inequality across regions, let's look at inequality across regions and industries at the same time, right? And then, we can even, the next step is going to be, okay, let's look at inequality across regions and industries and maybe gender. Okay, so we can sort of gradually increase the complexity of our models. I don't think the challenge here is going to be a data challenge. I think the challenge here is really a methodological challenge, right? That you really have to build these more complex models in order to be able to come up with more comprehensive answers.
Rafael, I mean, I can't let you go without asking you to very quickly address the current context in which we are. All the information we've looked at so far sort of takes place in a global context of globalization, as you set the stage very properly for that. But now we're at a sort of a turning point where tariffs are going up, and globalization seems to be in retreat. Should we expect to see the mirror image of the impacts you've described today, or have you been thinking about this? And what can you share with us in a minute or two?
Yeah, so I think what's happening now, and in particular, perhaps in the U.S. and elsewhere, is precisely a consequence of what I had just mentioned, right? So that trade is going to be hurting some people. And the government has not done a good job in acknowledging that these people have been hurt, and there's not been a good job in actually retraining these workers or giving them some sort of compensation for their job losses, and therefore they went to the poll, to the ballot, and they voted against globalization, right? So. And this is why, I mean, if you care about a globalization agenda, it's not enough to just open up for trade. You have to be thinking about, how you can share these gains, right? So this has happened here. This has happened in Europe as well. And so I think just only reinforces this idea that now more than ever is very important to not just defend trade, right? Because I mean, as trade economists, we used to think about trade as a no-brainer, and I do defend trade as a no-brainer, but it has to be accompanied by other policies which could allow these gains to be more properly shared across the economy. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We're at the end of our time. I want to reiterate our thanks for your presentation and your spending time with us here today. Really, really very interesting stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I mismanaged my time, but hopefully this entices most of you to take a look at the paper.
Yes, no, great compliment to the paper, which students have read, as have I, and thank you for putting it in context.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.